What's up, everybody out in Codex? Dan here with another interview with what I think is safe to say a comic book legend, at least in my eyes, Al Milgrom. So I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk with me today.
Well, sure. Legend seems a little, over the top as far as I'm concerned, but thank you for saying it. And I think it's just not so much I'm a legend, but I'm old. So, yeah.
Well, you definitely had a long, storied career, which I'm looking forward to talking with you about. So I guess we'll just go ahead and jump in. So I saw that you started working in comics in 1972 as an assistant inker for Murphy Anderson. So what I wanted to know is what's the difference between an inker and an assistant inker?
Well, essentially, I was his, his background guy. It's like an apprentice kind of situation. I had brought samples out to New York. I'm from Michigan. Jim Starlin and I were buddies. We were in middle school together, and he had been in the Navy and moved out here, and I college and then moved out here. Here being New York, and I took my portfolio around. Jim was getting some work already because he was so good, but I took my stuff up to Marvel and DC and Warren Publications. And they all said, well, you're not there yet, kid, but you got some promise, blah blah blah. And at DC Comics, I showed my stuff. I don't remember who I showed my work to. It might have been, I think it was Carmine Infantino, who was the art director or the publisher at the time. I don't remember exactly, but he was high up on, and of course I was a big fan of his work. He's a terrific cartoonist.
Oh yeah.
And I love his stuff. He was one of the great guys at DC. They looked at my portfolio and they called Murphy Anderson into the office. And Murphy, as it turned out, was a terrific, cartoonist from his sometime in the mid to late 40s. He started work, and he was inking Superman at the time for them. But he was a terrific penciler in his own right. Also, he had worked on the Buck Rogers news strip. He had done work for Planet Comics, the science fiction comics. He was a big sci-fi fan, and sweetest guy, a gentleman, nicest guy you want to know. Drew beautifully. I would personally, I was a fan of his work, but for me, the stuff that I was just gaga about was the Marvel guys, was Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko.
Oh yeah,
and so on. But yeah, so. Such eclectic tastes, I like the guys that everybody liked,
Well,
so
there's the reason everyone likes them.
But Murphy came in and he said, would you like to... Yeah, exactly. So he took a look at the portfolio and he said, would you like to... And Murphy was a rare bird in that New Jersey, but he commuted in every day to work at the DC offices. And
wow.
The reason why, it's sort of funny, is that his wife did not drive. And if he worked out of the house, she would always ask him to run errands for her. Oh, Murph, could you just go to the grocery store and can you take me here? So the only way he could get any work done is if he commuted into the city and came into the DC offices. They had a couple of spare drawing boards set up, and he was working at one. And he basically said, "Would you be interested in inking backgrounds for me, and I'll pay you, and you can learn while you make some money." So I actually didn't take the job immediately. I said, I'm interested, but actually I had known Rich Buckler, who was also from Michigan. And Rich had asked me to help him with some work as well. And, so what happened was I did that. I went to work for Buckler. He had the worst work ethic I've ever seen in my life. I mean, the plan was he was going to lay stuff out, and I was going to tighten up his pencils, and then he was going to turn them into Marvel. So I would save him, a considerable amount of work.
Mm-hmm.
And he was going to pay me he was going to pay me actually the same rate per page as Murphy was. So I would have done what were full pencils on over breakdowns or lay, and I guess they would have been sort of breakdowns. They were tight enough, but I didn't draw nearly as well as he did yet, if ever. And it was tough. And I actually went out to his house on Long Island and out pages, and he'd hand them to me, and I tightened them up. And he was doing 2 strips at the time. He was doing Kazar, and he was doing Man Thing. So, and as it happened, he had Bill Dubay helping him on Man Thing. So I was helping him on Kazar. And Bill Dubay was a writer, penciler, inker, and an editor for Warren Publications, the old black and white magazines, Creepy Eerie, Vampirella.
Yeah.
Anyway, so long story short, Rich was doing very little work. He would, one day he said, "Let's go to the beach," and we packed up. He had a wife and a nephew visiting from I think Puerto Rico, and we got in his car and we drove to the beach. And then we got to the beach, and he realized they'd forgotten to pack the lunch, so we had to drive back to his house and we had lunch. Then we went back to the beach, and so we're sitting there working on lap boards, which is not to me the ideal work situation. I like to be sitting at a desk or a drawing board, Anyway, within about 10 minutes, he developed a migraine and he couldn't work. So we went back to his house, and I don't know, I spent several days there, maybe a week. And it was a little awkward. I'm living at another guy's house and so on and so forth. Finally I said, "Look, I didn't pack enough clothes to be here this long. I didn't know we were going to be doing this and then, I went back to my apartment. I was sharing a place at that time on Staten Island with Starlin, Steve Skates, let's see, who else was in there? Bill Dubay was there. And geez, there's a 4th person. I can't remember who it was. That's embarrassing. Oh, well.
You lived in with Walt Simonson and Bernie Wrightson and Howard Chaykin, or was that a different?
That was later.
Okay.
That's a different one. Anyway, so I went back to the apartment. That was on Staten Island. It was an interesting commute for a guy from the Midwest, because to get I'll get to that in a minute. And Starlin and I went into the city, and we went by the Marvel offices, and Roy Thomas and heard we were there, and he came out and he goes, "Listen, you guys, I can't get a hold of Buckler. His phone's been disconnected." Probably for non-payment of bills, because Rich was always dodging the bill collectors. And he says, he's got this job. He's supposed to be doing a Man Thing story for us, and he was using some guy to tighten up his pencils. And we hired him because we wanted a hot young guy, cartoonist, to be competing with Swamp Thing and Bernie Wrightson, which who can compete with Bernie Wrightson?
Yeah.
But in their eyes, Buckler was. Excuse me, is that my phone?
No,
sorry, I didn't think to do. Nope, house phone. Okay, good. Let me just turn off the ringer. Yeah. Anyway, so Roy was like, he says that he's had this job for I don't know how long, and it's due, and we have to have it. And why was this our business? Because we were from Michigan also.
Oh,
He said, you guys, you're his friends. You better get hold of him somehow and tell him if he doesn't turn that job in on Monday, he's fired. So we go, oh my God, poor Rich, he's going to get fired. And so Starlin had a motorcycle. He says, come on with me. We'll go. And we got on the back. I got on the back of his motorcycle. We rode out to Long Island from the city, and or maybe from Staten Island. It's a long time ago, 1972, as you said.
yeah.
And we get to Buckler's place, and we said, what are you guys doing here? And we said, look, Roy Thomas is not happy with you. He says, that whoever you're using to help you on Man-Thing, it doesn't look like your work, and he's not happy with the results. And the script you have presently is late, and if you don't have it in the office by Monday or Tuesday, whatever the date was, you're going to get fired. And he went, oh my God, what can I do? And so Starlin said, look, we're here to help. So let's just, we'll come in. You can work on some pages. I'll work on some pages. Al will tighten up your pages, because that's the arrangement you've got.
Yeah.
And, we'll get it done. And it was only half a book. It wasn't an entire issue. And anyway, so we did. We came in, we sat down, we worked for, the entire weekend, and Starlin's very fast, and Rich is, was capable certainly of being fast. I think he had a lot of psychological quirks about getting work done, which is weird because, if you look at his career, he did a lot of work.
Yeah.
A lot of work. So I don't know why, he was having trouble in those days. But, we sat down and Jim went to the pages and I helped Rich on a bunch of pages and we finished the job. And I don't think we took it with us. I think we said, you better go into the office and deliver it so they see that you got it done. And maybe you should talk to Roy about, how to prevent this happening in the future. So we're leaving, and this story about Rich Buckler, considering we're talking about Murphy, but he's walking out the front door. Yeah, I ramble. We're walking out the front door, and he says, well, how can I ever, repay you guys? And Starlin very magnanimously said, look, someday if I'm in a deadline jam, you can help me on a job. Now, that's never happened in Jim's whole career. He's the most professional guy you ever want to meet. And I said, you can just, pay me my rate, which at the time was $5 a page. I think he was probably getting 25 a page to pencil. So I was supposed to get 5 of that for the pages I helped him out on. And I said, and listen, Rich, we were friends at the time. That is the case. Later, I said, just pay me my rate for our arrangement, the $5 a page for the pages I did. And so he said, okay, sure, good, fine. So we left, and he didn't lose his job at Marvel. But I told him, I said, look, Murphy Anderson offered me a job to work as his background assistant, and I think I'm going to take that. And he looked, flat, but why? I said, I've been working for you for a month now. I've done 12, I think it was, 12 pages. I said, that's $60. Is that math right? It's 5 times 12, 50, 60. Yeah. I said, I can't live on $60 a month in New York. He says, and I said, yeah, I did a handful of Kazar pages and I did a handful of these. That's all we've done in this entire time. And he said, well, and he says, but I can teach you a lot more than he can. And I said, here's a guy who's been in the business for 30 years. He's a very well-established pro and he's really good. And you've been in the business for, 10 minutes. I don't think so. But I said, that's what I thought. But I said, well, maybe that's true, but I know, he does a lot of steady work, and so I really think I'm better off working for him. So he said, well, okay, and then I had to chase him for about 3 years before he paid me. Butler.
Wow.
So $60 a month and wait 3 years to get paid. It was not a good business arrangement.
Yeah, that's not a great
and
thing.
Rich was always no. So back to Murphy, I called up and I told him, hey, I'm interested in taking that job if you're still interested in having me. He said, sure, Alan, great. So, come on into the office. And so to get from where we lived on the apartment in Staten Island, you had to take a bus to the ferry, the Staten Island ferry. Then you take the ferry over to Manhattan. Then you had to take the subway. I was traveling by train, by boat, and by bus
Wow.
to get there. The only thing I didn't do was fly, and so I would go in and commute in every day, and I'd sit next to Murphy right next to him at another drawing board, and he was working. I remember I sat down. I had my little bunch of equipment, pens, ink, and he handed me some Superman pages and said, okay, ink the backgrounds. And I went, because, Kurt Swan was like another terrific,
Yeah.
DC artist. Again, I love Kirby. I respected Kurt Swan. His stuff was, more or less flawless, beautifully drawn and all that stuff. But it didn't have the kind of dynamics that I liked in the Kirby stuff. But he had been the artist on Superman for many, many, many years. And so here all of a sudden is this, 21-year-old, 22-year-old, I guess at the time, sitting down and said, here, just ink these. And I went, ah. So I did. I sat down. I was like a little shaky at first, but then I settled down and I started doing it. And, I would show it to Murphy. He'd say, fine, you could do this. When you do foliage, try to do this. And he'd give me, he was a very patient, instructor. And, he taught me a lot. And in fact, at the end, we worked together for a year. And at the end of the year, he got the contract to do PS Magazine for the Army.
Oh.
And this was a magazine, I think it was the Preventative Service Monthly. And he had worked on the magazine previously with Will Eisner, who was the guy who packaged it for the Army. And Will had done it and Will was one of Murphy's actual heroes. He had been, around since the late 30s, early 40s doing, the Spirit, but he created the Blackhawks and any number of other early time characters. The Spirit's probably, his most well-known and recognizable, although probably in terms of general public recognition, maybe the Blackhawks were more so.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether he created what was that strip that Lou Fine did, the Ray.
Oh yeah.
For who was that for? Was that for? I don't remember who was that for. Well, whatever publisher it was, and the was it the Black Conduit? He did one about a guy who could fly. I should remember this, but and I've read many of them recently on an online site. Which let me give them a plug if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay. There's an outfit called Comic Book Plus, spelled out, and no, I don't think there's any spaces, and they have a huge archive of public domain comics. And I read on their site, I've been reading it very steadily. I read all the old MLJ characters. I've been reading Fiction House. They have like not Charlton, Fawcett. They have some of the Charlton stuff also, a good deal of it. And it's free, although they do ask for contributions. And I plan to send them a contribution. But in the meantime, I'm reading all this stuff that I've only ever heard about, and a lot of stuff I've never heard about that they have. They don't have any of the DC or Marvel stuff, but almost anything else that you are interested in. Although I notice on some of the some of the old reprint from the early days of comics when they were doing newspaper strip reprints. Some of the stuff they can reprint, and they can put on their site, and some, like if it's still like a syndicated strip that's still going, like Tarzan or Dick Tracy, they will not they can't use those. So but it's a wonderful site. I highly recommend. Anyway, so so where was I? I was working for Murphy, and after the year, so he decided he had put in Will Eisner decided he didn't want to do the PS magazine any longer, and Murphy knew the working for a number of years, left comics a while, I think, to work on it with Eisner, and he had put in a bid to get the government contract, and he had won the bid. And so often do PS Magazine. And he said, Alan, look, I like you and we work well together, and, your stuff's developing nicely. He says, I'd love you to come work with me on PS. Really not what I want to do. I have no particular interest in drawing tanks or Jeeps or guns, outside of a storytelling situation. And he said, well, I understand if you're called to do, I got to tell you, Alan, this industry is not long for the world. It's going falling. It's across the board, and there may not be an industry here to work for in 5 years. And I said, well, I have to take the chance. I want to do that. So he said, okay, I understand, and very nice about it. And he went off and he took over PS Magazine. I think Frank Giramonte was working for him, among others. But just about that time, this was like literally 1 year, almost to the day after I started working for Murph. I got a job. Starlin, called me up. He says, "Look, I got a job I'm doing for DC," and that Murphy was at DC. And he says, I convinced them to let you ink it. If I can probably get you in at Marvel. I said, okay, great. Thanks, Jim. Right. So he did a Gray Mouser story for the title Sword of Sorcery. I don't know why it wasn't Sword and Sorcery, which is the name of the genre, but at DC, I guess so they could copyright it with Sword of Sorcery. And these were characters, the Fafford and the Gray Mouser, characters by Fritz Lieber. He'd written several books about them. And Lieber, I think it's Lieber. Anyway, so Jim did this backup story in an issue of that comic, and I inked it. And Jim's stuff is tight and beautiful and could really virtually be shot off the pencils. Probably nowadays it would be. Although he still gets everybody, still inks him, so maybe not. But anyway, I don't know what the computers are capable of these days. So I inked it, and we showed it around. Everybody thought it looked really good, and so like in that same period of time, based on that job, Dave Cockrum. And I knew, I'd been meeting all the young guys in the business and so on, and some of the old pros would come in to deliver work. Dave Cockrum said, "Oh, Starlin stuff. I'm behind on an issue of Superboy. Could you, would you be interested in helping me out?" And I said, "Sure." So he said, "Well, okay then." He gave me, I think, maybe four pages to do, and he said, "Just ink everything, but not the faces, not the heads." I said, "Okay." So, and I did those, and he was happy with it. And right at the same period, Walt Simonson, who had been working, a few months earlier in the industry, he was doing the lead issue of Sword and Sorcery that I had done Starlin's backup story in. And he said, "Alan, I've laid out the whole story. But the deadline, Walt was one of the guys who, like, until the deadline got close, he couldn't get fully motivated, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of us were like that, especially in our young days, you know. So he said, "Why don't you?" This I was having echoes of Rich Buckler, because he says, "Why don't you come out to my apartment in Brooklyn, and you know, I'll tighten up the pencils and I'll hand them over to you, and you can ink them, you know, and we." And I said, "Sure, great." And I did, you know, and a week at his apartment. I think I took more clothes this time. And so he to me, and I'm inking them, and I'm sort of like, this is after a year working for Murphy. I'm sitting there sort of trying to ink Walt Simonson as if it was inked by Murphy Anderson, but not really, but sort of kind of, you know. So, but he was happy with the results, and his pencils were tight enough that it looked like his stuff, more or less. Walter's got a very distinctive drawing and inking
Oh, yeah.
style, and I probably wasn't yeah, and he's great, you know. And I probably wasn't quite versatile enough at the time to do a great Walt Simonson impression, but it was professional, and he was happy with it, and we got the job done in the course of a week. And I remember leaving his place, and I was by this time I was no longer living on Staten Island with Starlin and the guys. I had moved. Wait a minute, is that right? Yeah, I had moved. I had moved into Queens, and I was, you know, because the four of us in Staten Island had all gone our separate ways by this time. It was, you know, I don't know, maybe only I was only there maybe 6 months or so, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But Elliot S. Magan, who was the writer on Superman and doing a lot of work for DC, and I were friendly. And he had an apartment in Queens, and it was a 2-bedroom, and he needed a roommate to help, you know, cover the rent. And he asked if I'd like to, you know, move in with him there. And I said, great. You know, it was, you know, so I moved in with him. So I was living in Queens, and by this time, some time had passed. Elliot moved out to move in with his girlfriend at the time. So I had the place all to myself, and I needed help paying the rent. And so as I was getting ready to leave Walt's apartment, and by the way, down the block from Walt's apartment, Chaikin had a place, and Alan Kupperberg had a place. And I think Kupperberg just followed Chaikin around wherever he would live. He'd live nearby because they were good buddies. And anyway, but as I was leaving Walt, and it was funny because I went directly from Walter's apartment. I took a cab to LaGuardia and took a flight back to Michigan because I was going home for a visit. And as I'm walking out, I said, "Listen, I really had a great time working with you this week." And you know, Walter's a very, you know, wonderful, gregarious guy, and he likes to talk, and I like to talk, so we did a lot of talking. If we'd talked less, we probably would have gotten the job done much. I said, you know, I'm living in Queens, and it just moved out, and I've got an extra bedroom. So, you know, if you're interested, I'd love to, you know, I'd love to have a, you know, maybe you'd like to be, you know, come room with me. And he said, yeah, you know what, my lease is up here pretty soon. I'll think about it. So I said, okay, great. So I took off. And when I got back, he says, you know, I thought about your offer, and yeah, I'd like to move in there. It's closer to the city, and you know, we had a great time, you know, the week we spent together, and it sounds like a romance, but anyway, or bromance, I guess nowadays it would be a bromance. So he took me up on it, and he moved in, and we lived there for several years together. I don't remember exactly how long, and you asked about that apartment. That's the apartment where, over the course of several years, you know, Walt and I lived there. Chaikin moved in. I guess he got tired of Brooklyn also. Kupperberg moved in. At some point, Bernie Wrightson moved in. Who else was there? I think when Bernie left, Roger Stern moved in. And so it was a revolving door, you know, of cartoonists living in Queens. And at some point, Walter started dating Louise Wheezy,
Mm-hmm.
Jeff Jones's ex-wife, and he moved in with her. I thought, you know, boy, living with me is a great gig because, you know, you have a great time living there with me, and then you find a girlfriend and move out and move in with her. So and they ultimately got married, obviously. And so, yeah. So then I had the place all to myself. And then finally I was tired of the commute, and I moved into the city myself in a 1-bedroom apartment on 72nd and Broadway. And coincidentally, Walt and Wheezy got an apartment about a block and a half away from there. I don't
Oh,
remember whether they moved in first or second, but so we stayed close together in the neighborhood.
nice. Now you mentioned Starlin.
Yeah.
I know you guys were friends over the years and worked a lot together. And you were inking his work on Captain Marvel, and then he left, and you took over being as the penciler for it too. So, what was it like going from inking someone else on it to penciling the book yourself?
Yeah, well, the deal was, by the way, with that Gray Mouser job that we did together, at one point, Jim was very happy with it, and he took me up to Marvel shortly thereafter. It was very serendipitous because I was getting all these. I worked for Cockrum, I worked for Walt, um, and Jim went into Marvel, took me with him. We walked into John Verporten's office. He was the production manager, and he was a big guy, big heavy guy, glasses. He was always sitting there proofreading stuff. And Jim said, "Hey, John, this is Al Milgrom. He's going to be inking Captain Marvel from now on." And John, he looked up over his reading glasses, and he looked at me, and he shrugged, and he went, "Huh?" And that was it. I mean, that was how I got my job at Marvel. No, he didn't ask to look at my stuff. I think John was so overburdened with all the stuff. Marvel was expanding tremendously at the time, and he just probably nobody could keep up with it all. I think was the bottom line. And so he didn't say, "Let me see his work," or "Did you run this by Roy Thomas?" Nothing like that. He just said, "What can I do about it?" So from there, and Jim had been doing Cap. He had one issue beautifully inked by Dave Cockrum, and I think he had an issue or two inked by maybe Mike Esposito, and I don't think he was fond of Mike's inking on his stuff. And Jack Abel did one issue, and that was Jack was a good friend of ours, and very beautiful, slick inking, of course. In fact, he had been doing backgrounds for Murphy prior to my doing backgrounds for Murphy, because I think he'd been inking Superman himself, Jack had, and for whatever reason, Carmine wasn't satisfied with it. But he was reduced, to doing backgrounds for Murphy, and which was a shame because he was too good an inker to be doing backgrounds for somebody else.
Yeah.
And Jack also was a competent penciler, solid penciler. And I once asked him, I said, "Jack, why didn't you go?" He was freelancing for Marvel, inking Iron Man and stuff. I don't remember exactly the alignment of the dates, but they loved his stuff because Marvel, they were struggling. They had Kirby, they had Ditko, they had Dick Ayers, they had Don Heck, and they had a couple of other. Paul Reinman would do some inking for them, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
It was catch as catch can. Stan was trying to keep everybody busy, but he didn't have enough personnel to do all the work, and Dick Ayers would, if Jack Kirby wasn't available, Dick Ayers would draw the Avengers, and if Dick Ayers wasn't available to ink Jack Kirby that month, they got Steve Ditko to fill in on an issue of the Fantastic Four and so on. I mean, Stan was keeping all the plates spinning as best he could. And Marvel, their rates weren't as good as DC's, but their rates were, for a full page, were still better than what Jack was getting paid for doing backgrounds for Murphy, and he would have been better off. And I said, years later, when we were pals, and I was talking, I said, "Jack, why didn't you just go over to Marvel and they like you?" He says, "Oh, I don't know. I think it was a blow to his ego that he'd been demoted to a background guy at DC, and he didn't know whether Marvel would accept him, and he was using a pseudonym at Marvel." all the guys when they left DC to work for Marvel or were moonlighting at Marvel would use pen names because DC would sort of turn a blind eye to it. I can't imagine they didn't recognize the styles, but if you're making a living at DC and they didn't have enough work to keep you busy full time, they didn't mind so much if you worked for Charlton, you could use your real name there. But at Marvel, that was the big competition they were having at the time, and they didn't like it. So Jack Abel became Gary Michaels. That was his son's first name and his wife's maiden name. Mike Esposito became Mickey Demio, which was his son's first name and his wife's maiden name. Apparently, they all went to the same secret identity school. Gene Colan, when he did work for Marvel in the early days, was Adam Austin. I don't know where he the same pattern. The first guy, I think, I'm trying to remember. I think maybe the first guy who switched over, who just used his own name, was John Romita, and we know how that worked out. John, John was obviously a very terrific cartoonist, and he was doing romance stuff for DC. And in the earlier days, he'd done Western stuff, but the superhero stuff at the time was the primo stuff, and they just didn't think he could do it. I don't know. Why can't you see John doing Superman? Would have been great. So, or maybe, they were busy. They had to keep Kurt Swan busy and Kurt Schaffenberger busy, and maybe they didn't have enough extra work to hand around. But, anyway, all these guys were using pseudonyms, and then ultimately Ross Andru went over to Marvel also, and he used his own name, I believe. And suddenly, the floodgates had opened, and people were going back and forth. And DC couldn't afford to be that snooty about it and say, "Look, you work for Marvel, you're through with us," because by then Marvel was a very viable, competitor, and their rates were coming up. Jack Abel told me every time he went into Marvel and he did a job, they'd give him like $1 a page increase or $2 a page increase. And their rates were, maybe at DC, you'd get 25 a page for inking. At Marvel, maybe you were getting 15. But everyone, they keep bumping them up, and Verporten would take stuff in and say, "Great job, Jack Abel did on this last." And Stan would say, "Oh, that's great. That's he's like the slickest. I'll get him a raise. See if we can get him to do more work and stuff like that." So I don't know why Jack would have resisted, the impulse to go over and trying to get work, but he did. So, but ultimately he started, working pretty regularly for Marvel and almost not at all for DC. Well, actually, that's not entirely true, because ultimately I got an editorial job at DC, and then I started getting all my friends and cronies to come over from Marvel again to work at DC. And Jack did some, I think, Legion of Superhero stuff for me. I mean, he was good on anybody, and he inked my stuff. The 2 issues I did for Seaboard Publications, which is the company Martin Goodman formed after he sold Marvel. He wanted to. I think, I don't know. The story I heard that part of the deal was when he sold the company for, I heard, $8 or $10 million. So he probably thought, "Wow, it's great to be out from under that. I don't have to worry about the publishing and what's selling and what isn't. I'll never have to work again." But part of the deal was that his son Chip would work at the company in some capacity. And ultimately, whoever bought the company said, "Do we really need this guy here?" And they let him go. And so, in revenge, Martin Goodman said, "I'll show them. I'll start a new company, and we'll kick Marvel's ass." Well, he did start a new company. He did not kick Marvel's ass. And Seaboard, Atlas, whatever they called it at the time. It had a pretty short. Did it last 2 years? Maybe. They had a lot of titles that only lasted between 2 or 3 and 6 issues. Some of them probably longer. But it was an interesting experiment. They had Michael Fleischer, who had been writing for DC, did a lot of writing for them. I think a lot of people were a bit afraid to work for them in fear of retribution from either Marvel or DC. But I think Frank Thorne did some work for them. I know Larry Hama did work for them. Simonson did stuff. Did Archie Goodwin do some stuff for them? I think he might have. They had some really good talent working for them, but they had the oddest assortment of characters, perhaps in the history of comics. They were just Michael Fleischer had a very unique and bizarre sense of character and plots, and he did the Spectre at DC as well as it's quite interesting. The character he did, I worked on it, and we were very friendly, Michael and I. He had come into comics. He was putting together an encyclopedia of comics, and he did 2 or 3 volumes. I think he did Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. To do more, but I think there was not enough interest, and it was very dry. It was like, these were published when and by who, but it was a scholarly approach to the comics industry, and I don't think it sold well or caught on.
I've got 2
and
of
I
them.
actually was doing a lot of the
Superman, Batman.
Yeah, I think there were only 3 of them, so your collection is almost complete. So you got to hunt down that last one.
Yeah.
And I was doing a retouch. Because he was working as Joe Orlando's sort of assistant at DC, and so he had access to the library, and where they had all the old comics. I don't know if they were. I don't think they were in bound volumes. At him once time, he says, there were about 6 issues of Action #1, and now there's only 2. And I said, what? He says, yeah. He says, I told Joe, and he just said, don't start trouble. Like, so somebody was making off with Act #1, which, as you know, millions of dollars nowadays, was helping him. This black and white stats that he was using for. Did we ever work together? I don't think we ever actually worked together with him writing a script and me drawing a story. No, but his stuff was very interesting and offbeat. And we did this character for Scott, not Seaboard, Atlas Seaboard, and it was Morlock 2001. And I don't know where we came up with the title. I mean, Morlocks were the regressed, brutes from The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, and 2001 at the time seemed way off in the future. Not so much now. Now it's like that old saying: if I don't see you in the future, I'll see you in the pasture. We did that book, and it was this guy who wore a sort of a superhero suit. It was a futuristic setting. 2001, I guess, and he had a weird hairdo, like a sort of an upsweep hairdo. He kind of looked like a Dairy Queen, and with that swirl on the top. And I don't even remember how he got the powers, but at some point he was exposed to some radiation or something, and he would turn into this tree-like, plant-like creature who was a monster, and he would eat humans. I don't know if he actually devoured them or just sucked all the blood out of them. And in the first issue, I think it was, or maybe the second, there was some cute little girl, and I think she was blind maybe, and she had befriended the character, and then of course, and you go, oh no, they're not gonna, he turns into the monster, and you go, well, she'll get away or something, or he'll somehow his human nature will. No, he ate the kid. He killed the kid. And I went, and I said, Michael, this is just so weird. Who is this appealing to? This is not a hero. And he said, no, well, I'm thinking more in terms of Swamp Thing, Man Thing, and this creature was a plant growth kind of individual. And I only did the 2 issues, and somebody was Roy Thomas was he was mad that I was working for Seaboard, and I was doing Captain Marvel at the time. And I said, Roy, they're paying me more, so really I'm doing you a favor by staying on Captain Marvel at the lower rate. And he said, well, don't miss any of your deadlines for us then. I said, no, no, no. So anyway, I had a very, very brief career at Seaboard. And I went back to doing Captain Marvel, as you said. Starlin had done it. I don't remember exactly why he left it. Jim has a tendency to get annoyed with people. He just wants to be left alone to do his work. Mm-hmm. And he does, you can understand it. But I think maybe the powers that be at Marvel they wanted to use, because when Jim took it over, the book started selling better and better. He'd taken it over from Roy and Gil Kane, I think it was. And, here he was, a relative newcomer, and he's doing the book, and it's outselling these, Roy was still relatively new, but Gil Kane was certainly a great old pro. I don't know if they wanted to, hey, Captain Marvel's hot right now, let's put him in every other book we're doing. And Jim didn't like it when, they would take his characters and play with them. His characters obviously didn't own Captain Marvel. And I think he probably, I don't remember if he went to DC for a while. That was his pattern. He would piss him off, and then he'd go work for the other company, and then they'd piss him off, and then he'd go back. So, but he took over Warlock at some point, and I think that was also Roy? And they had, I think Gil did that character. It was an extrapolation of the him character from, Kirby and Lee's Fantastic Four. He was this golden looking man god sort of that came out of a cocoon somehow. And there were a bunch of, scientists who had genetically created him. So I don't remember a lot of the details anymore. But Jim took Warlock over, and he did, a great run on that book. And it was, it also started selling better and better. And he, it was very interesting because he had the Magus, that was the bad guy. And ultimately the Magus, you realized he was actually a future version of Warlock himself, Adam Warlock, except with an afro for some reason, a big puffy afro. I never understood how they were 2 distinct personalities or characters, but they were. Jim, I'm sure, explained it well. And, so, yes, but he had been doing Captain Marvel. And when he left to do whatever else he was doing next, maybe it was Warlock, they said, oh, what are we going to do? Starlin, was the big driving force behind this book. And they said, well, Jim, Al's been inking his stuff. And Steve Englehart is one of our hot young writers. And he and Starlin have worked together. And they came up, of course, with the idea for Master of Kung Fu. And so why don't we take Englehart, who worked with Starlin, and Milgrom, who worked with Starlin, and put them on the book and see how that works out. And I had, by the way, I had taken in some penciling samples to Roy. I worked them up. I did a really good job. I drew and erased and drew and erased. I had 2 or 3 pages. I believe it was Shang-Chi, and he was facing the Avengers. And so I had him, I did all the worst things you can do when you're trying to get a job, because I had them fighting in one of those stainless steel looking rooms that all the Avengers and X-Men seem to have. So I didn't draw anybody in street clothes. I didn't draw any, I didn't do any street scenes with buildings or trees or dogs. It was just superheroes fighting each other, which is what I like to draw. So, I'd taken them into the office on one of my trips in, and I wanted to show them to Roy, show him my samples. And I was sitting there, and he's on the phone, and I'm standing outside his office, and there's 3 or 4 desks outside his office where his assistant was sitting, and a couple of other, integral individuals were sitting and working. And I'm just standing there. And Starlin came by and he saw me and he waved. I said, "Hey, Jim." And he came back later and I'm still standing there. He says, "What are you doing?" I says, "Well, I'm waiting to show these samples to Roy." And he's on the phone and he's been on the phone for the last like hour and a half, you know. And if you know Roy at all, he is an inveterate talker. He can talk your ear off and still, you know, have plenty of verbiage left for the next guy. So I was just waiting for a break in the conversation. I don't know who he was talking to or what about, but it was going on. And so Jim says, "Let me see those." And he says, "Yeah, these look pretty good, Al." And he walks into Roy's office and he plops them down on the desk in front of Roy and he leaves. And Roy's sitting there still talking on the phone. He's going like, picks up the pages and he looks at me. He goes, "Hey, these are pretty good. Whose are these?" And I'm still standing outside his door. And I went, "They're mine, Roy." And he said, "Oh, yeah, they look pretty good, Al." I said, "Well, good, you know, because I'd like to maybe get into penciling more than, you know, just inking. Because my theory is that nobody wants to be an inker. This is probably not 100% true, but usually you want to be a penciler. And for whatever reasons, you settle for being an inker. Don't get me wrong. It's a respectable profession. They can really do a lot to enhance anybody's pencils or detract, but mostly, you know, they do. If they hire you, you do a good job. But you know, for whatever reason, you settle into inking. Either you're not fast enough as a penciler, or in the case of Marvel, you may not have the dynamics to do an exciting approach to the storytelling in that, you know, Jack Kirby, Gene Colan kind of John Romita approach, or you know, or maybe, you know, and there's also the chance that you'll be pigeonholed if you start as an inker. In the old days, this wasn't the case, but you know, over the years, if they liked you as an inker, they didn't want to have to, you know, wanted a pencil. They didn't want to have to find a new inker to replace you. So you had to fight that, and you know, very easy to get pigeonholed. And you know, but then you got guys like Tom Palmer, one of the greatest inkers of all time, who penciled beautifully and done it as a career. But Tom's stuff, as beautiful as it was not hiccup. It wasn't the most dynamic, but you couldn't fault the drawing and the rendering and the storytelling. So I probably, if he hadn't been working as an inker for Marvel, I would have thought he'd be a perfect penciler and or inker, you know, penciler inker for DC, because his stuff was a little quieter. And then, you know, but then you had Klaus Janson. Klaus was a terrific inker. He ultimately made the transition and did a lot of penciling for quite a while. I made the transition, and there are others. You know, there's you know, a number of people did it. And then there's like Terry Austin, who, as far as I know, did very little, if any, penciling. But he did some writing as well as inking, and he did, you know, beautiful, detailed, over-the-top inking. I remember Terry, another guy from Michigan. I didn't know him back there, but he came to the Marvel offices and he had samples, and they looked good, you know, and I'm sure some of them at least were his own pencils. And he says, you know, I've been to DC and I've been up here, and they said, "Oh yeah, the stuff looks kind of good, but it's not quite what we're looking for." And I said, "Well, listen, Terry, you know," and "Oh, you're from Michigan, I'm from Michigan, blah, blah, blah." I think we had worked on some fan publications together earlier. Anyway, so I said, "Look, it's my lunch hour. Why don't you come with me? I'll take you over to Continuity. They're always looking for, you know, for some warm bodies to help out over there." And Continuity was the studio that was owned by Neil Adams and Dick Giordano. And and Dick Giordano, another guy who had sort of fallen into being an inker. He had done penciling earlier in his career at Charlton and other places. He was a wonderful penciler, drew as well as anybody, not as dynamic Jack Kirby, well, who is, or Neil Adams, who as a, you know, was a terrific draftsman, but also very exciting stuff, very dynamic and unique and unusual. Anyway, I took Terry with me, and I introduced him to Neil, and I introduced him to Jack Abel. And I said, look, this guy's great. And I showed his work to Neil, and Neil said, you know who he'd be great on? Walt Simonson. And I was rooming with Walt at the time. And I went, so I was trying to foist Terry off on Neil, and Neil's now trying to foist Terry off on me and Walt. And I said, well, Walt inks his own background people. And I don't, he's not looking for anybody. Like I'm trying to get out from under. And finally, my lunch hour was up, and I said, Terry, I got to get back to the office. I said, just hang around here, get to know some of the folks, see what happens. And he did. He started hanging around there, and within a very short time, Dick Giordano found himself, with deadlines, and he said, I need somebody to help me on the backgrounds. Anybody here ink back? And Terry said, well, I could do it, And he says, okay, great. And he gave him a bunch of, I think maybe Conan pages to work on. He was working on a John Buscema breakdown job on Conan. And so here you have the Dick Giordano with this wonderful lush brush stroke that he has. And, he could use a brush like most people use a pen. He could get fine lines, but then he'd get this juicy black, in the areas with there. And because it was breakdowns, he had to know where to spot the blacks and stuff. And then there's Terry, who was doing this very fine. He didn't even use regular inking nibs, technical pens like rapidographs, where it was a dead line. But he was, he would go there, and I remember seeing a splash page, and there was all this foliage on the ground, and it didn't look like it sort of belonged in the same universe as the figures and the horses and stuff, but it was great. It was beautiful, very detailed stuff. And I remember I think I asked Dick, I said, Dick, are you happy with what Terry's doing? He goes, yeah, it doesn't look anything like my stuff, but it's great. I said, okay, good. So my job here is done. I've foisted him off on the right person. And then he started getting, doing it for the backgrounds for Dick, and then probably some other people. And ultimately, as is the want of the comic book industry, if you show you can do something, eventually they'll give you a job to do. And then if you do a good job on it, they'll give you more. And then ultimately, of course, he became the inker on the X-Men over John Byrne.
Yeah.
And I think John said Terry was not his ideal inker, but the fans loved him inking John more than any other combination. And I think that's accurate. That sounds about right. I think John's stuff is a little warmer, and Terry's stuff is a little cold and technical in a way, but he enhanced the pencils in a way that the fans just loved. And and he's got, as far as I know, Terry has virtually all the originals that he got back from those books.
Wow.
And that stuff, if you houses, a good average page from an X-Men by those two artists goes for $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 depending on the content of the page. Yeah. And I said, Terry, don't you want to get rich? He goes, no, I like having the originals. I said, good. I said, leave them to me in your will. I don't think I'm going to outlive them, but I can always hope. So anyway, so that let's see, penciling, inking. How did I make the transition? That was it. They wanted a sort of a Starlin lookalike, and as close to filling that bill as they could get at the time, I guess. So Captain Marvel, which was a bi-monthly, huh?
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, yeah, I was just gonna say that you had talked about how you worked for different companies, Marvel, DC, some other ones. I know one of the characters that you helped co-create for DC was Firestorm, that you created with Jerry Conway. And Firestorm, for a lot of us on the CODEX station, is a favorite character of ours. I wanted to ask you what went into creating that character.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, in fact, in 90, I think it was, switch. I was working for Marvel um, and I started doing a lot of covers for Marvel, and they have a tendency, if you do covers and they like them, they want you to do a lot of covers. So I mean, in the early days, Kirby did virtually all the covers for all the Marvel books, and still produced, I don't know, 3 or 4 monthly titles. Unbelievable, and they look good. They look great. I mean, he's my all-time favorite, and I think the combination, he was fast, his stuff looked great, and he was a wellspring of ideas. I mean, whatever the Lee Kirby debate is of who, I think once you're working creatively as a team, it's very hard to remember who did what. So I think Jack probably generated a lot of the ideas. I think Stan found ways to run with them and ways to humanize them, so that I've seen websites where they go, oh, you see here where Jack wrote in the margin, so and so says this, and Stan changed that. How dare he? And I think no, there's probably, he had a good reason, and Stan had this wonderful sort of gift of gab when it came to writing, and the stuff flowed. And I think Jack's writing was, while creative and interesting, was somehow not exactly the way people talk, and it hurt his stuff. I think it hurt his stuff at DC, which was brilliant and innovative. And I'm sorry it didn't go on a lot longer than it did, because they cut him off, because I think they thought it should sell like a Marvel comic. And I accounts, the Kirby books were selling well at DC, but not as good as the stuff he was doing at Marvel with Stan. So anyway, Stan had ways of like either reining Kirby in when necessary and adapting his stuff, and making it human. And it was a great combination. And I feel bad that there was animosity later in their careers, because they both benefited tremendously from working with each other. And I think it's, that was a high point in comics history. I thought Marvel did for superheroes what horror and science fiction, they really took it to a new and greater level. So wait a minute, what was your original question? Off on a tear.
Oh, I was asking.
Any idea?
I was asking what went into creating Firestorm with Jerry Conway at DC.
Oh, Firestorm, right. Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you. I went up to. I started doing cover sketches. Jerry Conway. There was a revolving door of editors in chief at Marvel, and at one point Jerry Conway became editor in chief, and he said, Al, we really like the covers you're doing for us, and I wonder, could we interest you in doing cover sketches for Jack Kirby, because Jack had returned from DC at this point. And he says, Kirby's like the face of Marvel, and we want to get him to do as many covers as he can, like in the old days when he did covers for all the books. I said, crazy? Why would Jack Kirby need somebody to do cover sketches for him? I mean, please, And he said, no, it's not that he's not capable of doing it. He says, but we'd have to ship him hundreds of pages of Xeroxes. We'd have to send him entire books of Xeroxes. And then he'd have to waste his time looking through them for a cover scene. And then he'd have to do the covers and ship them back. And it would take time, and you're local. You can come in. We'll give you the issues to look at, as we're doing them. And then you can come up with a cover idea, because your covers are good, and they're well designed. And he said, and then we'll send the cover sketches to Jack, and he can draw the covers. I said, you know what? I'm honored. I'm flattered. I said, one condition, I'll do it, but I want to ink the covers that Jack pencils based on my cover sketches. He says, no problem. We like everything you do. We like your pencils. We like your inks. We like your cover sketch, blah, blah, blah. So I did a bunch of covers sketches for Jack Kirby, and I put on my Kirby hat, and I did the closest I could to what I thought Jack would do. And either I was born out to be true in that regard, or he just said, this is what they want, this is what I'll give them, because he stuck very, very close to the sketches I had done for him. I mean, I don't know if he light boxed them, or they had opaque projectors called artographs that you could stick the thing in and project it down on the board, or if he just eyeballed it. I mean, probably with Jack, he probably just eyeballed them, and he stuck real close to my cover sketches, which again was flattering. And then he would send them in, and so on and so forth. And so one time I went up to Continuity, Neil's studio, and I said, "Hey, Neil, look, this is so great. They asked me to do cover sketches for Jack Kirby, up at Marvel." And I showed him the cover sketches, and he said, "Yeah, these are really good. They really look like Kirby stuff, And I said, "Yeah, that's what I was going for." And was dating or friendly with, at some point they were dating. He was dating Jeanette Kahn, who was the publisher at DC. And I think he said, "Jeanette, look at these, these great cover. Al Milgrom's doing great covers for Marvel." And so then I got a call from Joe Orlando to come in and do covers for DC. So I'll skip ahead. At some point, I was doing covers for DC, and Jeanette complained that my covers didn't look like my Marvel covers. But that was because Joe Orlando said, "Al, Jeanette likes your work, but we want you to do covers, but we don't want them to look like those Marvel covers," which is exactly what she wanted. And for some reason, Joe got territorial. It's like, and so at some point he called me into his office. "Al, Jeanette's upset, like your Marvel covers." I said, "Joe, you told me you didn't want them to look like my Marvel covers." And, so, I mean, they were still, but I was trying to, do like, I was thinking, a little bit of Neil Adams, trying to draw as well as Neil, who does. But, and, I said, "This is what you asked for." And he kind of goes, "I know. Meanwhile, did he tell Jeanette that he told me not to do them? No, he threw me right under that bus. But then at some point, Neil also thought to tell Jeanette that he thought I might make a good editor. And the insecure part of me thinks Neil just didn't really want me drawing anymore, because my stuff was not, it's not what he envisioned as like what the modern cartoonist should draw like. I think he was trying to save the industry from my penciling. And, so Jeanette offered me a job as an editor at DC. And I don't know. I don't exactly know what possessed me. Whoop, was that me? I was getting a lot of freelance work, all I could handle. But I thought, intellectual curiosity. What is it like on the other side of that desk? What's it like to, be an editor and to, try to put together a good team on a book and blah, 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 and influence people? So I said, that's interesting. I think I'd like to try that, Jeanette. So she hired me, and I went over and started working for DC. And at the time, you could still be on stage and freelance for DC. So they were in the midst of the DC explosion. There's the quote marks again. And the idea was they were tired of like raising 2 cents or a nickel every time it became, economically unsound to publish at time for forever. And they went up to 12 cents and then 15 cents. So they decided to like just take the bull by the horns, raise the price to, I don't remember, since they were going to go to 35 cents, which was a huge jump. But they were going to expand all the books. They were going to add an extra 8 pages, which is half of a signature. It has to do with the way the paper is folded and cut when they publish. more expensive. They'd have been better off going to a full 16 pages, but that was a lot of extra material to have to produce. So they were going to come out with a bunch of new titles and a bunch of new backup features in their books. I remember one of the ones I was involved with was in one of the Western books was Cinnamon. I think the tagline was "She had," so it was this cute girl who became a sheriff, and she had her dad's. He had been a sheriff who'd been assassinated or gunned down, whatever, and she had like the sheriff's badge, and she had it sharpened to could use it as a throwing star, a shuriken, as the Japanese, craze, or maybe that's Chinese. I think it's Japanese at the time, anyway. Martial arts stuff people were doing at the time, including Mr. Kung Fu. Anyway, so they offered me the job at DC, and now that you're up here with us, Jerry Conway is here with us, and he's got several new characters he wants to introduce, and one of them was Firestorm. To take credit from just the artist, not that that's not plenty, but Jerry, it was his baby. He had completely conceived of it. It was completely the premise was there, and I worked up some character sketches. I still have some of them around here somewhere.
Oh.
And anyway, we did the book, came out, and as you may or may not know, the DC explosion, suddenly they got a raft of sales figures. This could not have included the new books or the expanded books because they hadn't been on the stands long enough. And in those days, it took, I think, at least 6 months to get an idea of what the final sales were. So Firestorm lasted 5 issues. And they said, corporate, whoever owned DC at the time, said maybe it was Kinney Parking, which seems like an odd choice. They said, sales are horrible. You've got to cut the entire line by 40%. Cut all the 40% of the titles have to go back to the and Marvel in the meantime had kept the old format and the smaller size, and they were much cheaper, 25 as opposed to 35 cents. I know it doesn't seem like much now, but it was at the time. And they said, last in, first out. You got to fire that Al Milgrom guy. I don't think they specified me. They just said 40%, but it meant me and Larry Hama were both canned. But in the meantime, I had done Firestorm 5 issues. God knows whether it sold well or not. I actually had a 6th issue in the can, as they say.
Oh,
they really say that in the movie industry, not comics. But whatever. I'd done a 6th issue, and in fact, that they used it. They did a reprint edition of Firestorm, and they did use that finally some years ago. And interestingly enough, my son-in-law, who is a graphic designer, was working at DC at the time, but he and my daughter had met in college in Michigan, where he was from, and I was originally from, obviously. Anyway, he moved to New York to look for work and also to pursue my daughter, and he caught her finally, and now they're married, and I have 2 grandchildren from them. And but he was working in the design department at DC, and so he was the designer on the reprint issue of Firestorm. So there's a weird little bit of serendipity, I guess. So anyway, so we create, and I always thought I described Firestorm as being a Marvel character, most likely Spider-Man, but turned sideways a little bit, because it was, instead of, Ronnie Raymond was the jock, and he was the one who became the superhero, and Cliff Carmichael. So I'm amazed I remember any of these names at this point. Cliff Carmichael would bully him, but he was a wimpy little guy, and so it was sort of like the reverse of the Peter Parker Flash Thompson dynamic, where the bully was this wimp, but he would bully and tease him, and Ronnie couldn't beat the snot out of him because he was a nice guy and he didn't want to hurt any. Ronnie was too nice to just in the nose, so he took it.
Yeah.
And and then of course the other major change was that because of the way he got his powers, Ronnie, blended with Professor Stein. So Ronnie would become Firestorm, but he had Professor Stein's head floating around, giving him advice all the time. So I thought that was probably the most unique part of the character. It was the dual secret identity.
I always loved how,
and then I don't know what happened.
I'll say I always loved how Ronnie would hear the professor and be talking to him, but since nobody else could, they would kind of frequently, especially in Justice League, make that joke like, "Oh, is this guy crazy? He's just rambling to himself."
Yeah. Well, it kind of reminds. Yep. In hindsight, it's sort of like the situation on Quantum Leap.
Yes.
Where the time traveling guy is talking to the hologram all the time, and people go, "Who the hell are you talking to? What's going on here?" So it's sort of like that, I guess. And of course, Professor Stein, was older and wiser, and I guess some kind of a scientific genius, as are so many in comics. And so he could give Ronnie some useful advice about how to use his powers and so on. So it was kind of unique, and so I have a long career of very brief runs on books. When I did, I actually did. I did Captain Marvel for I think 5 years.
Wow. Yeah.
And it was a bi-monthly, so that wasn't a bad run. But the Guardians of the Galaxy only lasted 9 or 10 issues when I did it, and Firestorm only lasted 5 or 6 issues when I did it, and I take some solace from the fact that Jack Kirby had a lot of titles that I thought were great, which had very short runs. He had, I mean, certainly before he landed at Marvel and did, very long runs on the FF and Thor, but he did Strange World of Your Dreams was a title he did back for Harvey, I think it was back, under Crestwood. It was he and Joe Simon's own imprint. And the Boys Ranch lasted maybe 7 issues. Fighting American lasted 7 issues. What was that other boys book? It only lasted 1 or 2 issues. Boy Explorers, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And then he did, Stuntman, who lasted only 2 issues. So I take solace in the fact that the greatest comic book artist ever had a lot of very short runs on a lot of titles too.
Well, I know one book.
On the other hand, his romance. I'm sorry.
I was going to say one book that I know you had a long run on for Marvel was when you were the editor of the entire run of Marvel Fanfare, and that book at the time would get the like the best of the best creators, had a higher paper quality, higher price, and and you would draw yourself into each issue for that editorial section that was something that hadn't really been done before in comics. What was it that gave you the idea to do that in the book, and and make that book with all those top creators?
Yeah, it's a shame I may have drawn myself in, but it's too bad I couldn't have drawn in more readers. But anyway, that's my bad pun for the day. Okay, no, yes, I had gone. I worked at DC. I did Firestorm. Oh, wait a minute. You just sped up. You looked like you were in fast motion there.
Sorry.
Maybe there was a lag. It just caught up or something. I think every time I bump my mouse, it freezes the thing here. I got to try to stop. I worked for DC for, again, almost exactly a year to the day. I seem to have a pattern. Like when I worked for Murphy at DC, I worked almost exactly 1 year. And when I was an editor at DC, I worked almost exactly 1 year. I mean, if it wasn't to the day, it was to the month, certainly. But I got they came and said, look, corporate says we got to lay everybody, 40% off. And they said, we really liked what you did for us here, but, there's another editor who's young and he's got a wife and kids, and you're single, so we don't give a shit about you. No, they didn't say that. They said, and I said, yeah, not a problem. I'll go back to freelancing. It's no big deal. And I called up Marvel and I said, hey, look, I'm leaving my job at DC. I said, but I'd like to come back and work for you guys if you're amenable. And they said, what are you doing right now? And I was sitting at my I was sitting at my desk at DC, packing up my stuff. I said, nothing important. And they said, can you come over? I said, sure. And I went over and they gave me an issue of Star Wars. It was I'll never forget. It was a Herb Trimpe issue.
Okay.
And I loved Herb's stuff, and I loved inking his stuff. Tight, beautiful pencils. Anyway, and within a couple of days, Jim Shooter called me and said, Al, listen, can you come up and talk to me? I think we might have something for you. And I thought, oh, good. Now that I'm back doing some stuff at Marvel, they're going to start flooding me with freelance, and that'll be great. No, Jim said, look, I'm trying to put together an editorial staff. There had been a long line of reviewer editors. There was Stan forever, and then Roy Thomas for a little less than forever. But then it went through Marv and Len and Jerry Conway. And I remember that Archie Goodwin was very annoyed that Jerry Conway got that job before Archie did. Because, Archie had been around longer and had certainly had seniority at Marvel. But Jerry only lasted a very, very short period of time, maybe a month or two, long enough to get me the gig doing cover sketches for Kirby, but not much longer than that. But I'm eternally grateful. And, and obviously we had done Firestorm. He went, that's when he went to DC, and ultimately I went to DC and we did Firestorm. Well, so, and after Jerry left, then Archie got the nod to become editor-in-chief. And then he realized what a thankless, hopeless job it was. And they hired Jim Shooter. And Jim did the smart thing. Instead of trying to be Stan Lee or Roy Thomas and run the whole thing, he said, this is insanity. The books are later than hell. Nobody seems to make a deadline. A lot of the writers currently are their own editors. They basically, Len Wein and Marv Wolfman and maybe Jerry. I don't remember how long after he left the editor-in-chief job it happened, but they all made deals where, okay, we'll be our own editors and we'll produce X number of books. And Len and Marv were doing like a reasonable amount of work, and Jerry, I think, wanted to do 8 titles a month, which is just insane. It's not impossible. And he's a very good and certainly facile writer, but that's a lot of work. That's a lot of work. And the downside of being your own editor is, A, maybe you don't see that there's a reason for editors. You don't see the flaws in your own work. And B, even, as you're working, you're not sitting there, flogging yourself on the back to get the work done. It's like, well, maybe I'll just take the rest of the day off. No, you got to have an editor calling up going, that book's due in Thursday. Is it going to be here? And then you go, oh, that's right. I can't take the time to go to the beach and have a picnic. I'll just do this. So anyway, Jim had worked at DC, and he came from that tradition of the editorial staff, learned under Mort Weisinger, who'd been, the head of DC and the Superman books. So he said, I want to put together an editorial staff. And he went to the powers that be at Marvel at the time and said, look, I want to hire an editorial staff. And they went, are you out of your mind? It's always been we have to pay like 5 more people to be editors. We were, before, the editor-in-chief would just handle everything, and we could save all those salaries and all those perks, which were not that great at the time, by the way. And he said, how much did we spend on late charges at the engravers? And how much time did the printer, how much extra overtime did the printer charge us because the books were getting there late? And how many times did we miss the deadline so badly that we had to throw in a reprint issue at the last minute because nobody got the jobs done. And they went and looked at the books and they said, oh my God, we spent untold hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions. And okay. And they said, is this going to fix the problem? He said, I guarantee you, give me some time and a staff and I can fix it. And so, DC had, their explosion had become an implosion. And I went over to Marvel. And thought that would be enough for anybody, but no, Jim hired other people too. He, at one point, I'd been working there a little while, and he said, "Hey Al, what do you think of Larry Hama?" I said, "Larry's great. He's a terrific writer. He draws like a son of a gun, and he's a really good editor too." He says, "You think he'd be interested in working for us?" I said, "I have no way of knowing, but I could certainly ask him." So I took Larry out to lunch. We had a nice lunch together. And then at the end, I said, well, the reason I called you here, Larry, is Jim's trying to put together an editorial staff, and he wanted to know if you'd be interested in coming on board. He says, yeah, I think that would be good. I said, great, I'll tell him. So I went back to the office. I said, Jim, Larry's amenable. Give him a call. And then, I think Jim's hired Jim Salicrup as I don't know where Jim came from or how he got there. But he did. And then, and I said, who's a really good editor is Louise Jones up at Warren. Bill DeBay had left to move to the West Coast and do something else. And she had inherited the position of editor at Warren. And it was 3 or 4 titles. And I said, she does a great job over there. And I said, maybe you want to, give Wheezy a buzz. And he said, yeah, that's a great idea. And he hired Wheezy. And somewhere along the line in there, he hired Mark Grunwald. And so now all of a sudden he had an editorial staff. And so the next step was, this is a very roundabout story to get to how I got to Fanfare. But, Jim, he hired all the warm bodies, old pros who hadn't done any work lately, young guys who were just breaking in and maybe weren't quite there yet professionally. And he had the whole new editorial staff do inventory issues while they were trying to do the books on a regular monthly basis. He said, let's do this. Let's do a book with Spider-Man and The Thing and Iron Man. And it'll be an inventory story. And if in a pinch, we can use it as an issue of the Fantastic Four or Spider-Man or Marvel Team Up, or the Avengers, it could fill in for any one of those titles. And while that it won't fit into continuity, which was Marvel's strong suit, of course, but at least it won't be a reprint. And, people won't be paying for like a brand new cover with a reprint inside. And, it'll be a new story and it'll be better than the alternative. And that's what happened. Suddenly everybody was getting all the work they could handle and more, and producing the regular books as well as, inventory issues. And that slowly but surely solved the deadline problems that Marvel was having. And they got all the books on time again. And, I was up there for, I believe, 5 years on staff, 1 year at DC, then 5 at Marvel. And near the end of my tenure at Marvel, they had started doing direct sales. And what the direct sales market was a whole new innovation in comics. And as you recall, earlier in this ramble of mine, Murphy Anderson had warned me that the comics industry would be dead in 5 years. And this was about 5 years later. And what happened was Phil Suling, who was a big fan guy and who ran the New York Comic Con in its early days, started, and I don't know if he had a comic shop or something along those lines, but he contacted the companies and he said, look, I would like to of comics from you as you publish them, but I would like a deeper discount than you give the regular wholesalers and newsstand salespeople. But in return, I won't return any copies for credit, which was the business model in those days. You'd send 100 comics to a drugstore, and then they'd sell 60, and they would get credit for the unsold 40 comics. And his premise was, you send me 100 copies of this book, and I want a bigger discount, but I will not return any of them. So, he would order the number of copies he needed, and maybe with a couple extra to put in the bins for resale later. Mm-hmm. And so that's basically the birth of the direct sales market. And more of these little entrepreneurs sprung up all across the nation doing the same thing. And so this had become like a big and growing chunk of our business. And, Jim Shooter, who I got along great with, by the way, he had once expressed the point or the fact that we didn't make money on our advertising. And I looked at him aghast, something like this. There's aghast. And I said, what is that? What do you mean we don't make money? How is that even possible? And he goes, well, we get paid for the advertising, but we don't make like a profit on the advertising. This was semantics. He said, most magazine publishing, they would, have subscriptions and newsstand sales and a cover price, but the real money they made was not from selling the copies for 50 or 75 cents each, but they would sell major advertising based on the circulation. They would sell ads to, Coca-Cola and General Motors and perfume whoever thought their market would be well served by advertising in those magazines. That's where they made their real money. It was nice to get the money from the newsstand sales. It helped defray costs. But in comics, we really made our money on the cover price. Mm-hmm. But I said, well, what about all those little ads for X-ray specs and whoopee cushions? He says, yes, we get paid for those, but the real advantage for us there is that's like 10 pages per issue, where we don't have to pay for the editorial content, writer, penciler, inker, letterer, colorist, and whoever else was involved. So they didn't have to lay out that money for the creative people, and they got, mediocre money from the advertisers because, the manufacturer of the whoopee cushion could not spend a lot of money on ads. So anyway, so I said, Jim, I'm curious, growing part of our market. I said, what would it take to do a comic with no ads, and all editorial content, not only the 32 interior pages, but the covers. And, maybe we could do it like on better paper, higher quality paper. And what cover price would be necessary to make it profitable? And the answer is they wouldn't know until they knew what the sales were, really. It's like if it sold 1 million copies, well, you don't have to charge as much. Mm-hmm. But he went to the the business people and the accounting department, I guess, and said, what would we have to sell a comic book for with higher quality paper and no ads, and I don't remember what the original price was on Fanfare, $1.25, $1.50. I don't remember. It was substantially more than the regular books. Mm-hmm. I don't remember what they were selling for at the time either. But the bottom line is, he said, Al, they say if you can sell a decent number of copies, this is the price. And I said, oh, okay, that's good to know. And he says, so when are you going to do it? And I said, do what? He says, this new title on the good paper. And I said, well, wait a minute. I said, if we're going to do this, and it's going to be a kind of a prestige format, I have to make it, I want to get the best people on it, and I want to pay them a premium rate. And he said, okay, that makes sense. I said, I'd like to pay him like rate and a half. He said, okay, rate and a half. Sounds good. So we went back to the accounting department, and they ran numbers. So that's probably when they ultimately came up with the cover price, because now I'm wasting another 50% over and above on the editorial cost. And and then they said okay, and they green lighted it, and I didn't have anything for it. I just said it was an idea I had. He says, right, well, we're the house of ideas, so do it. So no good deed goes unpunished. So I frantically, and they wanted to put it on the schedule like almost immediately. And so a lot of people have the misconception that Marvel Fanfare was initiated as a way to burn off inventory. Now we had too much inventory sitting around the drawers after getting caught up on the schedules. No, that is not the case. It was intended to be used to just do what I thought of as really good material in a premium prime format with the best people that I could find, and reward them by giving them an extra 50% above their rate. And that was it. That was my idea. Now, having said that, the first issue, I found in a drawer at the office an issue of Marvel Team Up, Michael Golden and Chris Claremont, with Spider-Man, and I think it was Kazar and the Lost Land and all that stuff. And Michael Golden is like a genius, and you look at his stuff, you want to cry. It's so good. And Claremont, obviously, the non-Periel, wrote the X-Men. He was just like the fan fave for many decades, if he isn't still. But I'm not saying he's not. And so I said, hey, what are you doing with this? Well, they did this issue, and Chris has got a plot in for the next, the rest of the story, but Golden doesn't have time to do it, and blah, 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 blah. I said, you know what? Can I have it? And they said, please, take it out of here. We don't even want it anymore. It was going to be Marvel Team Up, I believe. So I said, okay, great. And I called Chris, and I said, Chris, I got this great story you did with Golden. I want to publish it in Marvel Fanfare. And I said, but I guess Michael's not available to do the subsequent storyline. I said, but how about you give me the rest of the story, and I'll find some good artists. And he goes, well, I don't know. I really wanted Golden to do it. I said, no. I'm paying you an extra 50% above your rate, including for the one you've already completed, to do the job. And he says, oh, an extra 50%? Done. And so he wrote I got, other people to do it. I think my backup story in the first issue of Fanfare, if I'm remembering correctly, was a Daredevil story by Roger McKenzie and Paul Smith. Does that sound familiar?
It might, yeah.
It might have been, because Paul was a guy, he was an animator, and he had sent in samples. And I said, yeah, you're great. This is the genius of Al Milgrom here. I see your stuff, and I see it's great. And he did a job for me. And then and it was great. And I said, hey, how would you like to do, the next chapter of this Chris Claremont story with Spider-Man and Kazar? And I think some of the other X-Men were flying around in there. Anyway, he says, good. Yeah. I'm tired of the animation business. I'd like to do this. So he did that. And I don't even remember who did the other two stories. Did Dave Cockrum do one? I feel like Dave Cockrum did one. And I can't even remember, I don't remember who I think maybe each chapter had a different artist.
Oh, froze again. Oh, still frozen. Hello?
but it's been a long time and I don't really remember.
Oh,
Like 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 my villainous Killer Frost that I created with Jerry Conway over at Firestorm there. She's actually been my most successful best-selling Dan Kelly art. You froze on my end. Oh, okay. You typed me a message there, I see.
yeah.
Now wait, now I got to get rid of that. Will it go away on its own?
Oh yeah, if you just click the little downward kind of facing arrow in the corner, it'll go away.
I'm trying. I'm afraid to use my mouse because that seems to make it freeze. Well, it's not showing up at your end, this thing you wrote me?
No.
Okay, then I'll try to ignore it. Yeah, so what was the last thing I said?
You were saying you had different artists doing the different chapters on the story for the Marvel Fanfare?
Yes.
For Claremont?
Right. Yes, that and oh, well, Paul Smith, who had, excuse me, it is annoying. Hold on, I'm getting my mouse. I hope this doesn't freeze us again. Let's see. Okay. Oh, great! Now the cursor's gone.
Oh,
I will be the only one cursing from now on. Oh wait, there it is. No, I don't see it. Huh? I'll soldier on. Yeah. Paul Smith did the second chapter, I believe, or maybe the third. I think Dave Cockrum did one. And Paul was a guy who was in animation and sent in samples that were just terrific. And this is the genius of Al Milgrom. When I see a good artist, I know he's a good artist, and I can tell, and then I give them work. So, and I've had a pretty good track record in terms of that, because Paul Smith was my discovery, if you will. Nolan was my discovery. Mike Mignola was sort of my discovery because he wanted to be an inker, and I said why, and he wasn't getting any work as an inker, so I got him to do a job for Marvel Fanfare, and then that really launched his penciling career. And he went on to do many other things, including, of course, Hellboy, which became a movie franchise. Mm-hmm. Who else? Who else did I create? Oh, damn it! Wait a minute, I'm having a senior moment here. He did Spider-Man 2099. Rick Leonardi.
Rick Leonardi.
Yeah, I gave him his first job. I was somewhat responsible for Ron Friends, because actually Shooter deserves a credit there, because he had met him at a convention in Pittsburgh, where they were both from, and Jim brought some samples of his back, and I said, yeah, this guy's pretty good, and I put the samples in a drawer, and then at some point Wheezy needed a penciler for Kazar, I think it was, and I said, wait, I think I got, she couldn't find anybody to do an issue. I said, wait, Shooter found a guy in Pittsburgh. I think he's really good. And I showed him her the samples. And I said, she goes, oh yeah, this guy's great. I said, yeah, I think he's really good. So we called him up and we said, hey, do you want to do an issue of something? And he says, sure, and the rest clearly is history. He did that. And an early Star Wars again that he did. I remember the splash with Darth Vader on it was great. Yeah. And of course, I had a long career inking Ron Friends, whose pencils were wonderful and enjoyable. And he was like the sort of almost the archetypical Marvel artist. I mean, he combined many of the best aspects of Kirby, Ditko, John Romita, and the Buscema brothers. That's a lot of high praise right there. Anyway, so I got Paul Smith to do an issue, and I think maybe Cockrum did an issue of that story. And I started commissioning leads and backups from all over the place, but I was not above using inventory material if I felt it fit the category for what I was trying to do. And sometimes I would try out new guys in backup stories if I thought they were excellent. And there was a guy who'd been around for a while, Tony Salmons, who was a very good artist, had a very unorthodox style. And I thought, he might not be right for a mainstream book like, the Avengers or Defenders or anything, but I can put him in fanfare because I like his work. Mm-hmm. And I think it offers something that a lot of the, more, standard type cartoonists, offered. So I would do that. And you mentioned earlier about the caricature of myself that I do in Marvel fanfare. And that came about because Shooter said, okay, we're going to go ahead and do fanfare, but, probably it would be a good idea to have a letter column, even though it was ad-free. Mm-hmm. We can have a letter column, and I think there should be you should do an editorial page. And I just, I'm primarily an artist, a cartoonist, and not a writer. I've done some writing in comics, but the idea of having to fill an entire comic book page with typewritten stuff was just daunting to me. I said, oh my God, I'm going to have to write. How many typewritten pages is that going to be? And he says, oh, I don't know, 2, 3. I don't know what it broke down to. And I said, Jim, how about if I do it as a comic strip, with me as an editor? He says, yeah, I'm okay with that. I said, and can I get paid freelance for doing that? And he said, I can probably swing that too. I think I probably paid myself $8.50. So, nice. And it was simpler thanks. And I'd never actually considered doing cartoony stuff. Cartoony, here again in the quotes, because I wanted to do superheroes and the serious straight stuff. And so I sat down and I did it. And some people have said, it reminds them a little of Harvey Kurtzman, which is very flattering, of course. But I wasn't that familiar with Kurtzman's stuff at the time. And he had that strip in the old days. He used to do Hey Look or something. And, I was probably thinking, a little bit more along the lines of Jack Davis. But I'm sure I had seen some Kurtzman stuff. So maybe that entered in there too. But it wasn't a specific homage to either guy, but just, me extrapolating my drawing style into a cartoony form. And so I think I roughed out the first one, and I was, I did whatever it was. I think Shooter came into my office going, when are you going to publish that fanfare book, Al? And then the last panel is him, kicking me out of the panel. Or did I kick him? Either way, one of us kicked the other one. And I had it roughed out on the page editorial. And then I said, hey, you know what? If I put a hyphen in here, is that a hyphen? Is it the dash?
The dash.
Which one's the, huh?
Yeah, I think so.
Which one's the hyphen? Is that the possessive thing, the hyphen? I should know this stuff. But no, I think a hyphen is right. Hyphenated is when you put the dash. So I said, hey, I could be editorial dash Al. I said, oh, and I like puns, and Murphy Anderson used to be an inveterate punster also. So I like a good pun or a bad pun, depending on your definition. And so I put the dash in there, and I became editorial Al. And I want you to ask Shooter, I said, Jim, I feel like Marvel now owns my likeness. I said, I might like to do something with this version of me somewhere down the line. And he said, don't worry about it, Al. We're not gonna possess your likeness. And I said, okay. He says, if we have to, we'll rent it to you for $1 a year or something. I said, good. I'll hold you to it. Anyway, so I started doing the editorials, and it was just what I hoped was a humorous approach to telling you about the contents of the issue, or some of the freelancers that I'd inveigled into doing the book for me, and so on. And the book became a very good success, and sold well enough to justify the cover price. And by the way, at least one issue, Murphy Anderson had left PS Magazine because the Army chose a lower bid. He'd done it for several years, but it went by, lowest bid would win the contract. And so they took it away from him. And within a matter of a few months, the guys who had won the contract could not produce the magazine to their satisfaction, the Army. And they begged Murphy to come back and do it. But he said, no, they knew the kind of job I did. I was doing good work for them. They went for a lower bid, and I'm not coming back to do it for them, even at the higher bid that I made, because he felt he was hurt. He was insulted. He thought that they had a, blah, blah. Anyway, so comics isn't the only business that will crush your soul. The Army will do it too. The U.S. government will do it too.
Oh,
anyway,
yeah.
so he, So anyway, Murphy had started a business of color separations because he'd learned the business, I guess, while working at PS Magazine. And they used ruby lith, which is a thing where you would cut out these red plastic sheets and stick them down on copies of the artwork. And then, it would be for different percentages of colors. It was a different approach than they used in the comic industry, but he could do much more sophisticated stuff. And I actually, he did an issue of a Fanfare for me. I think it may have been that issue, the all burn Hulk pinup issue. I mean, splash page issue, where he did a story for the Hulk that was rejected because it was all splash pages. And I said, hey, John, again, I'm, looking for anything that I thought would fit the bill for Fanfare. And, I was a big fan of John's work. And I thought, apparently the story was rejected by Denny O'Neil because he said, I don't have anything against the splash page format, but he says, I don't feel like there's enough story in this 22 panels is what it amounted to, which is the equivalent of about four or five pages, maybe. He said, I don't feel like there's enough of a story to justify a whole issue like this. And I said, oh, well, I'm happy to justify a whole issue of Fanfare with it. And in fact, it would only be like the lead story in Fanfare because it would still leave, 32 pages, 22, another 10 pages of material I can put a backup in. So, so I swiped that one, and Murphy, I got to give Murphy a job, which was kind of nice. And anyway, and Editorial was born. And since then, I've used that character. Somebody contacted me about doing reviews of some independent comics. And so he sent me a batch of these comics, and I read them and I gave my critical opinion of them. And in fact, I gave my critical opinion, and the character who was discussing these things, I named him Critic Al. So there's Editorial, there's Critic Al, and I just had a T-shirt made for me by Mark Grunwald's widow, Catherine, very nice lady, and we met and were friendly. And I told her this idea that I'd mentioned to a number of fans at conventions, and that was that I wanted to have a T-shirt made, and I wanted to, because when I go to conventions, I'm autographing and sketching, and people hand me money. It's very nice of them, and I take the money and I stuff it in my T-shirt pocket. And the problem with that is that every time I have to make change, I reach in there and I take out this, hopefully large wad of bills, and I have to find the different smaller bills to make change with. And I said I wanted to have a T-shirt made where I had 3 separate pockets, one for 5s, one for 10s, and one for 20s. And then I wanted to get a logo designed across the top. Here's the gesture. And I wanted to call myself Convention-Al. So now I've got another. Yes, that's me. And then for when I leave at the end of the day, I should probably have one made that reads Unconvention-Al. So
that could be the backup.
I got a bunch of personas going on here, all off the same bad pun. But but I like the idea, and of course, it would be a conversation piece. And practically speaking, if she actually sewed 2 extra pockets on, and she did a press on lettering for these T-shirts. She made me 2 of them, and but I actually want to go and see if I can get a friend, a good letterer, probably Jack Morelli, who's a good friend of mine and a spectacular letterer, and have him design a logo for it and get some made, and find a seamstress who can actually sew the additional pockets on. It turns out Catherine gave me a good hint, because apparently she bought an extra a couple of T-shirts, and she could actually take the sleeves off at the seam. She could take the sleeves off and use them as the pockets.
Okay.
And because the sleeves have the little reinforced cuff at the bottom here, she could use that as the top of the pocket, and that's reinforced, and it's a perfect scenario. So now I just have to go have Jack design me a logo, and then go find a seamstress. I think my wife uses somebody at the local dry cleaners, and I'm going to get that done, and hopefully that will be before I die, and so I'll still be able to get some use out of the joke.
That's
not
awesome.
that I'm dying anytime soon, but if I don't have a deadline, I'm very, very bad at getting things done.
Well, I know, that, you've had a long storied career in the industry, but you are retired now. But you said you do commissions. Like you said, you do them at conventions, but, people can also email you here so that they can get some commissions done. So I highly encourage everyone to, and you said you do appearances at conventions. Do you have any conventions lined up for the rest of this year that you want to tell anyone about?
Well, so nice of you to ask. I happen to have a list right over here. I will grab it. And let's see. I do have a number of conventions that I'm planning to go to. These are not all nailed down yet, but I'm doing the Little Giant comic show in is it Concord, New Hampshire? Is that right? I believe that's so. That's April 12th. Then let's see, I might be doing, no, that one I could, they were booked. So April, May, no, that's no good. Sorry, I'm looking at my list. May, okay, June. I'm probably doing one in Shelton. Oh no, that's for Shelton. No, it's the Heroes Con in Charlotte, North Carolina. Yeah. That's run by Shelton Drum. Mm-hmm. That's June 14th through the 16th. I may also be doing. Oh yeah, July. I may be doing one in Raleigh, North Carolina. I have to contact the people. That's the 25th through the 28th. I don't know I think that's the Galaxy Con, actually. Yes, that's a Galaxy Con. That's July 25th through the 28th. And I may be doing one. I haven't ironed this out yet, but there's a show in Rochester, New York, July 12th and 13th. So that's July. Let's see. I'm doing the show at Terrificon at Mohegan Sun in Connecticut. That's the big casino there. That's August 16th through the 18th. That's a terrific show also. All of these, as far as I know, are really good shows. Many of them I go to every year virtually. And then that's August 16th to the 18th. Yes, August. Let's see, August. Okay, August. September. Oh, the Baltimore Con. That's the big one down there every year.
Yeah,
that's a terrific. Yeah, we met there. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So that's a terrific show. Very, very much comic oriented. You don't get so much of the wrestlers and the other stuff.
Yeah, that's why I like it.
So I don't have to be intimidated. So anyway, although I had a good time at a one-day show in Florida one time. I met Hacksaw Jim Duggan.
Oh, wow.
And my son, yeah, my sons, he was the nicest guy. My sons were big wrestling fans when they were a little bit younger, and they were impressed. I got a photo with them. So, and then finally, I have a show. Wait a minute. Oh, that I again may be going to in Columbus, Ohio, December 6th to the 8th. That's another Galaxy Con, because the guy who runs those shows puts them on all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he puts on a very good show also. So there's the list, such as it is, and I'm not. Many of those have actually, have been locked down. A couple of them have not. So, but if you check the schedule online for the different shows, they'll have a list of who's there and who's not, or who's going to be there and who's not. So yeah, thanks for the plug.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say I highly encourage everyone to to go up, say hi, shake your hand, get a commission. I know at Baltimore this year, I have an Avengers jam piece that I've had started that I only had 2 characters drawn on. So my plan is to come up and hopefully get you to add a character on there, for me, because I'm a big fan of your Avengers.
Yeah, I remember. I think you. Yeah, you sent me a scan. I think you had Captain America drawn on it already. Maybe?
Yeah, I drew the Captain America on it, and then at Baltimore.
Oh, you drew?
Yeah, I did the pencils, and then last year at Baltimore Comic Con, I got Russ Braun to add a really cool looking Incredible Hulk to it.
Ah, nice. I don't know Russ or his work, but I'm sure it's impressive.
So
well, okay. If you're doing the jam, I'll be the peanut butter.
I appreciate it. So yeah, like I said, everyone go up, shake his hand, tell him how much his work means to you when you see him at a convention. I am looking forward to doing that at Baltimore Comic Con. Email him on here to get a commission. And while you are online, make sure that you check us out online at thecodexstation.com. You can meet all the team members, get some merch, get links to all of our socials. And this interview will certainly be going up there soon. Again, I want to say thank you for taking time out of your day to sit here and talk with me today. This has been fantastic. I've really been looking forward to sitting down and talking with you.
Well, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I enjoyed it, but I guess I sort of love hearing myself talk. But and unfortunately, if any, I've done a couple other podcasts in recent months. And I feel like I tell the same stories over and over again, just like an old guy should.
Yeah, they're great stories.
I hope I had a couple of original kernels of material in there somewhere. But listen, the stories are what the stories are. I'm not gonna change them. So I'll keep telling them. So I guess that's it for now. So this is Editorial and Critical and Conventional and Unconventional signing off.